The air in the staging area of Kill House Omega was thick with the scent of gun oil, sweat, and stale bravado. It was a smell Lieutenant Maya Sorensen had known her entire adult life. Yet here, it felt alien, corrosive. She stood apart from the others, methodically checking the seals on her gas mask, her movements economical and precise. Her M4 carbine rested against the gear rack, meticulously cleaned, its optics calibrated to a perfection that bordered on obsessive. She was the new variable in their equation, the officer with the quiet eyes and the transfer papers that offered no explanation. To the men of SEAL Team 3's Echo Platoon, she was a ghost, and an unwelcome one at that. "Hey, Lieutenant," a gravelly voice drawled, dripping with condescension. Petty Officer First Class Rivas, a man built like a concrete barricade and known universally as Bull, swaggered over. He held out a magazine for her sidearm. "You dropped this. Almost forgot your lipstick." A few of the younger team members snickered. Petty Officer Jensen, the comm specialist they called Weasel, echoed the laugh a half-second too late, as always. Sorensen didn't look up from her mask. She simply extended a gloved hand, taking the magazine without a word. Her fingers, lean and strong, brushed against his. Bull flinched, as if he'd touched something cold. She slid the magazine into her pouch, the click of the Kydex holster the only sound she made in response. Her silence was a vacuum, pulling the heat and noise out of his mockery, leaving it hollow. "Don't want you running out of ammo in there, ma'am," Bull pressed, unwilling to let the moment die. "Might break a nail trying to reload." "I'll manage, Rivas," she said. Her voice was low, calm, betraying no emotion. It wasn't a challenge or a retort. It was a statement of fact, as plain and unadorned as the rifle she now picked up. She slung it over her shoulder, the weight settling into a familiar and comforting groove. Master Chief Petty Officer Cade Thorne, callsign Goliath, watched the exchange from across the room. He was a relic from another era, a man whose operational history was the stuff of hushed legends in the BUD/S barracks. His face was a roadmap of hard-won battles, and his eyes held the weary skepticism of a man who had seen too many promising recruits, and too many officers, fail when it mattered. He had made his opinion on Sorensen's assignment clear to the commander, calling it a social experiment that had no place in his platoon. The brass had overruled him. Now she was his problem. He strode into the center of the room, his presence instantly silencing the low chatter. "All right, listen up. Today's run is a simple hostage rescue scenario. 2 tangos, 1 hostage, top floor. Standard stack, standard entry. Rivas, you're on the door. Sorensen, your point. We're testing your integration into the element." The assignment of point man to the newcomer was a deliberate test, a trial by fire. It was the position of highest risk and required the most instinctual trust from the men behind you. Giving it to Sorensen was Thorne's way of saying, "Show me." Bull Rivas's lip curled into a barely concealed sneer. Putting the new lieutenant on point was like handing the keys to a race car to a student driver. He'd be right behind her, ready to clean up the mess. "We go on my mark. Simonition rounds. You get hit, you're dead. Drag yourself to the dead box and reflect on your failures." Thorne barked, his eyes lingering on Sorensen for a fraction of a second. "Questions?" Silence. "Good. Gear up. 2 minutes." As the team moved to do their final checks, Rivas accidentally bumped into Sorensen, his shoulder pauldron knocking hard against her rifle. "Watch your step, Lieutenant. It's a dangerous world out there." Sorensen merely adjusted the sling on her shoulder, her gaze fixed on the door to the kill house. She didn't see Bull discreetly nudge her spare rifle magazine with the toe of his boot, sliding it just under the edge of a gear crate where it would be difficult to find in a hurry. She was already in the zone, her mind mapping the building schematics she'd memorized that morning. The world outside the mission was already fading away. The mockery, the hostility, the heavy weight of their disbelief. It was all just noise. And noise was the first thing you learned to filter out. The pre-drill briefing was held in a sterile, white-walled room adjacent to the kill house. A large monitor displayed a 3-dimensional layout of the target structure. Master Chief Thorne stood before it, a laser pointer in his hand, a grim statue of authority. The rest of Echo Platoon sat on hard plastic chairs, a sea of fatigue-clad muscle and quiet intensity. Sorensen sat slightly apart, her posture perfectly straight, her focus entirely on the screen. Objective is the third floor, room 304, Thorne began, his voice a low rumble that tolerated no interruption. The red dot of the laser pointer circled a small, square room at the far end of the building. Intel suggests one hostage, male, non-combatant. 2 hostiles armed with AK variants. They're jumpy, but not expecting a full-scale assault. This is a surgical operation, not a sledgehammer. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the team. It was a look that had unnerved hardened operators for 2 decades. When his eyes fell on Sorensen, they hardened. Lieutenant, you have point. You'll lead the stack up the central stairwell. We'll be running a dynamic entry. Rivas will breach. Once the door is open, your job is to clear the first immediate threat. You go left or right, you call it, and the rest of the stack flows in behind you to fill the room. Is that understood? Understood, Master Chief, Sorensen replied, her tone level. Bull Rivas shifted in his seat, a smirk playing on his lips. Master Chief, with all due respect, dynamic entry on an unknown room layout is risky. Maybe a more experienced pointman would be better suited to make that first read. It was a direct challenge, thinly veiled in procedural language. He wasn't just questioning her ability. He was questioning Thorne's judgment in front of the entire platoon. The room grew tense. Weasel Jensen coughed, a nervous, sycophantic sound. Thorne's jaw tightened, but he didn't reprimand Rivas. He was letting the challenge hang in the air, another stone added to the weight on Sorensen's shoulders. Petty Officer Rivas's concern is noted, Thorne said, his voice dangerously soft. However, the order stands. The lieutenant is on point. Her performance will be evaluated. As will yours, Bull. As will everyone's. He clicked the laser pointer off, the sudden absence of the red dot feeling like a final verdict. This exercise is about cohesion, about trusting the person in front of you to do their job. If you can't do that, you're a liability. His eyes met Rivas's, a silent command passing between them. Rivas gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He would follow the order, but his dissent had been registered. He had planted the seed of doubt, not just in Thorne's mind, but in the minds of the junior team members who looked up to him. He had framed the exercise not as a team effort, but as a test of the woman who didn't belong. Sorensen showed no reaction. She continued to study the schematic on the screen, her mind tracing the paths, calculating angles, and identifying potential choke points and fatal funnels. The bickering was irrelevant. The politics of the team room were a distraction. All that mattered was the geometry of the problem in front of her. She noted the position of the windows in room 304, the swing of the door, the likely placement of furniture based on standard layouts. Comms check, Thorne ordered. Jensen, eager to perform, began the roll call. Goliath, this is Weasel, radio check. Loud and clear, Thorne grunted. Bull, check. Weasel, check. One by one, the team sounded off. When it was Sorensen's turn, she simply keyed her mic twice. The 2 sharp clicks in affirmative that was more efficient than words. It was an old habit from a place where radio silence was paramount. Rivas snorted quietly. Too good to talk to us now, Lieutenant? He muttered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. Thorne ignored it. Final preparations. The exercise is live in 5 minutes. Remember the rules of engagement. Identify your targets. No blue on blue. Any questions regarding the objective? Sorensen finally looked away from the screen, turning her head slightly to face Thorne. Master Chief, the intel says 2 hostiles. Is that confirmed? Or a best guess? The question was sharp, professional. Cut through the petty tension. Thorne seemed taken aback for a moment by its directness. It's the best intel we have, Lieutenant. Why? Best guesses can be wrong, she said simply. I'll proceed as if the number is unconfirmed. Thorn stared at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It might have been annoyance at being questioned, or it might have been the first tiny spark of professional respect. You do that, Lieutenant, he said slowly. You do that. Now get to the insertion point. As the team filed out, Rivas fell into step beside Jensen. She's questioning Goliath's intel now, he whispered, his voice a mix of outrage and satisfaction. She'll crash and burn. 5 minutes, tops. Jensen nodded eagerly. She won't know what hit her. Dynamic entry. She's going to freeze. Sorensen walked past them, her stride even and unhurried. She didn't hear their words, or if she did, she gave no sign. She was already inside the kill house, her mind running the simulation, her body preparing for the violence to come. The dismissal from her peers was a distant hum, a frequency she had long ago tuned out. The only signal that mattered now was the one that would come from Thorn, the signal to go. The simulated steel door of the kill house loomed before them. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. Sorensen knelt at the front of the four-man stack, her M4 held in a low-ready position. Her breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm, an internal metronome counting down the seconds. Behind her, Rivas shifted his weight, the heavy breaching shotgun in his hands feeling like an extension of his own brutish confidence. Behind him, Jensen and a younger SEAL named Miller were poised, their own weapons trained forward, ready to flow into the room behind their pointman. Through her earpiece, Thorn's voice was a dispassionate command from the observation deck above. Stand by, execute. The word was barely spoken before Rivas stepped forward, a blur of motion. He placed the breaching charge on the door's lock mechanism. A low pop echoed in the narrow hallway, followed by the metallic shriek of the lock giving way. Rivas slammed his boot into the door, sending it swinging inward, then immediately fell back into the stack. Go, he hissed. Sorensen moved. She didn't hesitate. She was a coiled spring released, exploding into the threshold. Her eyes, trained by thousands of hours of repetition, scanned the room in a fraction of a second. Threat assessment was instantaneous. Right, she called out, her voice crisp and clear over the comms. She pivoted right, her rifle snapping up. A cardboard target with the black silhouette of an armed man stood half-hidden behind a stack of crates. Two precise, controlled shots from her M4 struck the target's center mass. The red paint marking of the simunition rounds appeared like sudden, bright wounds. The team flowed in behind her. Rivas went left, Jensen and Miller fanning out to cover the center and corners. The room was cleared in less than 5 seconds. It was a textbook entry, clean, efficient. But something was wrong. Sorensen felt it in the subtle shift of Rivas's position behind her. As they moved to exit the room and proceed to the next, he crowded her, stepping just a little too close, forcing her to adjust her footing on the slick concrete floor. It was a microaggression, a physical assertion of dominance so small it was deniable, but so deliberate it was unmistakable. It was meant to throw off her rhythm, to put her off balance. She compensated instantly, her body adjusting without conscious thought. They moved up the first flight of stairs, a grim four-person machine. The second floor was a series of small, interconnected offices. They cleared them one by one. Sorensen's movements remained fluid, but the team behind her felt sluggish, disjointed. Rivas was a half-step too slow on her calls. Jensen seemed to be fumbling with his comms equipment. Report! Thorn's voice crackled in their ears. Second floor clear. Proceeding to third, Sorensen reported, her breathing still even. As they reached the landing of the third floor, the final objective lay down a long, narrow corridor. The door to room 304 was visible at the far end. This was the fatal funnel. Suddenly, the lights in the entire building went out. They were plunged into absolute, disorienting darkness. Not just a dimming, but a complete and total blackout. The only light was the faint green glow from their night vision goggles. What the hell? Rivas grunted. Goliath, we have a power failure. Negative bull. Thorn's voice replied, now laced with a cold, sharp edge. This is a scenario change. Adapt. Before anyone could process the new directive, a thick, acrid smoke began to pour from vents in the ceiling. It wasn't just theatrical fog. It was dense and oily, designed to defeat thermal and night vision optics. The green world through their NVGs dissolved into a swirling, impenetrable soup. Smoke! Smoke! Jensen yelled, his voice tight with panic. Can't see a thing. Weasel! Get your head right, Rivas snapped. Masks on. They fumbled with their gas masks, the sound of their own panicked breathing suddenly loud in their ears. Sorensen had her mask on and sealed in under 3 seconds. She had anticipated it. The moment the lights went out, she had started preparing for the next escalation. Goliath! Comms are breaking up, Jensen shouted, his voice now distorted by his mask's diaphragm. Static flooded the channel. I'm getting interference. That's part of the test, Weasel. Thorn's voice cut through the noise, laced with disappointment. Work the problem. But the channel went dead, replaced by a loud, hissing static. They were blind, deaf, and alone. The simple drill had become a nightmare. Rivas, stripped of his sight and his bravado, was just another man in a dark room. He reached out, trying to find the wall to orient himself. All right, stay put. We regroup, he commanded, trying to assert control. But his voice lacked its usual authority. It was the voice of a man guessing. A sudden burst of simulated automatic fire erupted from down the hallway. The staccato pops of the simunition rounds were deafening in the enclosed space. Red paint splattered against the wall near Miller's head. Contact front, Miller screamed, firing blindly into the smoky darkness. Hold your fire. You don't know what you're shooting at, Rivas yelled. Another burst of fire, this time from a different angle. A round struck Miller in the chest plate. He grunted. Hit! I'm hit! Chaos descended. The stack, the pillar of their training, had crumbled. Jensen was frozen, trying desperately to fix his useless radio. Rivas was yelling orders into the void. Miller was out of the fight. And Sorensen was gone. In the first few seconds of the blackout, she had melted into the shadows, disappearing from the spot where she had been standing. Rivas, reaching out to find her, found only empty air. The point man, the one they were supposed to trust, had vanished. To him, it felt like abandonment. In reality, it was the beginning of the hunt. The darkness was an old friend. Maya Sorensen moved through it not with sight, but with a kinesthetic memory honed in places that never saw the sun. While her team was blinded, she was in her element. She had ditched her useless NVGs the moment the smoke hit, relying instead on senses the others had allowed to atrophy. The air currents on her face, the subtle vibrations in the floor, the acoustics of the hallway. This was her new terrain map. Her breathing was the only constant, a slow, silent exchange of air through her mask's filter. She had detached from the panic shouts of her team. Their chaos was a liability she had to isolate herself from. The mission parameters had changed, but the objective remained. Hostage, 3rd floor. The new, unseen hostiles were just complications to be solved. She moved along the wall, one gloved hand trailing lightly against the cinder blocks, giving her a constant point of reference. Her M4 was held tight against her shoulder, the barrel pointed forward. Ready. She moved in a low crouch, minimizing her silhouette, each footfall placed with deliberate, practiced silence. She heard the clumsy, shuffling footsteps of Rivas trying to find his bearings 20 feet behind her. She heard Jensen's frantic, muffled curses as he smacked his radio. They were broadcasting their positions to anyone listening. They were loud. They were predictable. They were targets. A floorboard creaked softly to her left, from an open doorway she had noted on the schematic. It was a sound so faint it would have been lost in the calm static and shouting, but in her focused silence it was a gunshot. She froze, melting back against the wall, becoming just another shadow in the smoke. She waited. 1 second. 2. 10. Patience was a weapon, and she was a master of it. A figure emerged from the doorway, a dark shape moving with a confidence that meant he had his own source of vision, likely advanced thermal optics immune to this type of smoke. A new pop-up target, a role-player Thorn, had injected into the scenario. He swept his weapon across the hallway, its IR laser, invisible to the naked eye, cutting through the gloom. The beam passed over the spot where Sorensen had been standing a moment before. Sorensen didn't engage. Engaging from the hallway was a fool's errand. It would be a 50-50 firefight and would give away her position to any other hostiles. Instead, she waited for the figure to pass. He moved down the hall, toward the sounds of Rivas and Jensen. He was hunting the noise. Once he was past her, she slipped into the room he had just vacated. The air was clearer here. She pressed her back against the wall next to the doorframe and listened. She could hear the new hostile engaging her team. The sharp pops of his simunition rifle were answered by a wild, inaccurate volley from Rivas. He's fixing their position, she thought, driving them into a corner. She unholstered her sidearm, a suppressed Sig Sauer P226. In the close confines, the quieter report would be an advantage. She peered around the doorframe, her eyes now adjusted to the near-total blackness. She could just make out the muzzle flash from the hostile's weapon as he fired another burst. He was using the corner of the hallway for cover, pinning Rivas and Jensen down. Sorensen raised her pistol. She didn't aim for center mass. She aimed for the sliver of space where she calculated his head would be. She controlled her breathing, exhaling slowly. The world narrowed to her front sight post. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shot was a dull thump, barely audible over the chaos. There was no answering cry. The role-players were trained not to react, but the hostile's muzzle flashes stopped. One problem solved. She didn't wait for confirmation. She reholstered her pistol and moved on, deeper into the building, leaving her team behind. They were compromised. Saving them wasn't the objective. Securing the hostage was. She moved with a chilling economy of motion, a wraith in the smoke-filled labyrinth. She found the stairwell and ascended, her feet making no sound on the metal steps. The third floor was just as dark, just as choked with smoke. But up here it was quiet, deathly quiet. She knew this was a deliberate design. The noise below was meant to distract, to draw the team's focus while the real threat lay in wait here, near the objective. She crept down the final corridor toward room 304. She could feel the vibration of a low-frequency generator through the soles of her boots. It was a common disorientation tactic. She filtered it out. As she neared the door, she went prone, crawling the last 10 feet on her belly. It was slow, agonizing work, but it kept her below the sight line of anyone looking out a peephole or under the door. She reached the door and pressed her ear against the cold metal. Nothing. No voices. No movement. But the absence of sound was itself a warning. She pulled a small fiber-optic snake camera from her utility pouch, a piece of equipment she had signed out that morning, much to Weasel's amusement. "What are you going to do with that, Lieutenant? Look for spiders?" He had jeered. She slid the thin camera under the door, the tiny lens feeding a grainy, black and white image to the small screen on her wrist. The room was dark. 2 figures stood over a third, who was kneeling on the floor, hands bound, the hostage. The 2 hostiles were wearing the same advanced thermal gear as the one downstairs. They were staring intently at the door, their rifles raised. They were waiting for the breach. They were expecting a loud, dynamic entry. Sorensen formulated a new plan in seconds. A frontal assault was suicide. But there was another way. On the schematic, she had noted a ventilation shaft that ran adjacent to the room. It was a long shot, a path no one on the team would have even considered. It was small, cramped, and not designed for human passage. She crawled back from the door and found the vent cover on the wall, 10 feet down the hall. Using her multi-tool, she silently removed the screws. The cover came off with a low groan of stressed metal. The shaft was barely 2 feet wide. It would be a tight squeeze, even for her lean frame. She slung her rifle across her back, drew her suppressed pistol again, and wormed her way into the blackness of the vent. It was claustrophobic, filled with dust and the smell of decay. She moved inch by inch, her shoulders and hips scraping against the metal. The only sound was the rasp of her gear and her own steady breathing. This was a different kind of warfare. Not of overwhelming force, but of infiltration. Of becoming a ghost in the machine. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint outline of light ahead. The vent grate leading into room 304. She pushed her snake cam through the grate slats. The view was perfect. She was positioned on the wall behind and to the left of the two hostiles. They were still focused on the door, completely unaware of the threat suspended just feet away. She carefully, silently, removed the grate. She held it, not letting it drop. She placed it gently inside the vent shaft. Then, holding her pistol with both hands, she peered through the opening. She had a clear line of sight. 2 targets. 1 hostage. No margin for error. She took the first shot. The man on the right. A single, quiet thump. The simunition round struck him in the back of the helmet. He didn't even know what had happened. The second hostile spun around, startled by the sound, his rifle coming up. But Sorensen was already on him. Her second shot was fired before he could acquire a target. It hit him squarely in the chest. 2 shots. 2 tangos down. She dropped lightly from the vent into the room, landing in a silent crouch. She moved immediately to the hostage, a realistic mannequin, and cut its zip-tie restraints. Objective secured. Just as she finished, she heard heavy, panicked footsteps pounding down the hallway. It was Rivas. He must have finally gotten his bearings and decided to charge the objective alone. "Breaching!" he roared. A fraction of a second before he slammed his full body weight into the door. The door flew open. Rivas stumbled into the room, rifle up, ready for a firefight. He found Sorensen standing calmly over the secured hostage, her pistol held in a low-ready position. The 2 dead hostiles lay on the floor nearby. The room was still, the smoke slowly beginning to clear. Rivas stared, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene. He looked at the downed hostiles, at the open vent on the wall, at the silent woman standing before him. He saw the impossible. From the observation catwalk high above, the lights suddenly flooded the room, bright and painfully sterile. Master Chief Thorne stood at the railing, a microphone in his hand, his face a mask of stone. He had watched the entire thing on a monitor fed by a hidden thermal camera, a camera whose existence was known only to him. He had seen her disappear. He had seen her hunt. He had seen her use the vents. He had seen the 2 perfect, clinical shots. The exercise was over. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. The lights bleached the room, chasing away the shadows that had been Sorensen's sanctuary. Bull Rivas stood frozen in the doorway, his M4 still shouldered, a monument to bewildered masculinity. His breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline of his pointless charge leaving him shaky and exposed. He looked from the 2 neutralized role-players to the hostage mannequin, then to the open vent cover on the far wall. The story pieced itself together in his mind, a narrative so alien to his own doctrine of shock and awe that it barely seemed possible. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered, he had been rendered completely irrelevant. Sorensen, in contrast, seemed unaffected by the sudden glare. She holstered her sidearm with a quiet click and methodically retrieved the vent cover, her movements calm and economical. There was no triumph in her posture, no "I told you so" in her eyes. There was only the quiet efficiency of a job completed. She was a professional finishing her work, and the stunned audience was of no concern to her. From the catwalk, Master Chief Thorne's voice boomed through the speakers, devoid of emotion. "End exercise. Echo platoon, assemble in the staging area. Now!" The walk back was a silent, funereal procession. Miller, the junior SEAL who had been killed early on, was waiting for them, his face a mixture of shame and awe. Weasel Jensen trailed behind, his eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding everyone's gaze. His prized comms gear, his entire identity on the team had failed him. But it was Rivas who was the most profoundly shaken. He walked with his head down, the swagger gone, replaced by a heavy, lumbering gait. He kept glancing at Sorensen, who moved with a light, untroubled stride, as if she had just returned from a routine patrol. He was trying to reconcile the woman he had mocked with the phantom who had just dismantled a scenario designed to break them. In the staging area, they stripped off their gear in silence. The usual post-drill cacophony of loud jokes and exaggerated stories was replaced by an oppressive quiet, broken only by the clatter of weapons being placed on racks and the hiss of Velcro being torn open. Master Chief Thorne entered the room, and the silence deepened. He didn't yell. He didn't debrief them on their tactical failures. He walked directly over to the main console in the corner of the room, the one Jensen used for monitoring communications and personnel files. Jensen, seeing him approach, practically jumped out of his chair. "Jensen," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "Pull up Lieutenant Sorensen's file." "Master Chief," Jensen stammered, confused. "You heard me. Her full service record. Now." With trembling fingers, Jensen typed in Sorensen's name and service number. The security clearance prompt appeared. Thorne leaned over and entered his own high-level authorization code. The file opened. The screen filled with lines of redacted text. Mission locations, unit designations, operational details, all of it was blacked out. It was the file of a ghost, but a few key lines were visible. Thorne stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Read that line," Thorne commanded, pointing to a specific entry under Previous Assignment. Jensen squinted, leaning closer to the screen. He read the words aloud, his voice barely a whisper, a strange mix of disbelief and dawning horror. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Spectre Program." A few of the men who heard it shifted uncomfortably. Most had never heard of it. It sounded like something out of a spy novel. But Rivas knew. He had heard the rumors, the ghost stories that senior operators told over beers, tales of a deep black unit that didn't officially exist. A unit of solo operatives, specialists in clandestine infiltration, surveillance, and neutralization. They weren't door kickers. They weren't the hammer. They were the scalpel that excised a single cell from a body without leaving a scar. They were called specters because they were never seen, only felt. And their call signs were often drawn from mythology, from things that owned the dark. Sorensen was still at her station, disassembling her rifle for cleaning, seemingly oblivious to the drama unfolding around her file. Jensen, still staring at the screen, scrolled down further. His eyes widened. Call sign. Her call sign was Nyx. The name landed in the silent room like a physical blow. Nyx, the Greek primordial goddess of the night. A figure of such power that even Zeus feared her. It wasn't just a cool nickname. It was a statement of purpose, a reputation, a warning. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her silence, her preference for the dark, her impossible infiltration through the vent, her precise, quiet shots. They had been mocking a predator, unaware of the nature of the beast in their midst. They had been testing a great white shark by seeing if it could swim in a kiddie pool. Their arrogance, in retrospect, was terrifyingly naive. Rivas felt a cold dread wash over him. His taunts about lipstick and broken nails echoed in his mind, now sounding like the idiotic babbling of a child poking a sleeping lion. He had challenged her. He had tried to intimidate her. He finally understood the cold, empty space in her eyes when he tried to provoke her. It wasn't fear or weakness. It was professional disinterest. He was a problem so small, so simple, that he wasn't even worth her attention. His career, his entire identity as Bull the Breacher, the unstoppable force, felt like a cheap costume in the presence of something so lethally authentic. Master Chief Thorne turned away from the monitor, his face grim. The pieces had fallen into place for him, too. The cryptic orders from command, the insistence on her placement, the redacted file. It wasn't a social experiment. It was an integration. They had sent him one of their ghosts, and he had treated her like a rookie. The weight of his own misjudgment settled heavily on his shoulders. He was Goliath the giant, and he had just been humbled by a whisper in the dark. Thorn walked slowly from the console toward the center of the room. His heavy boots echoed on the concrete floor. Every eye was on him. The men expected an explosion, a tirade about their failures. They had, after all, completely fallen apart. Their performance had been a disgrace to the trident they wore. But Thorn's focus was elsewhere. He walked past Rivas without a glance. He walked past Jensen, who flinched as he passed. He stopped directly in front of Sorensen. She had just finished laying out the components of her rifle on a cleaning mat, each piece arranged with geometric precision. She looked up at him, her expression neutral, her gaze steady. She was waiting. Thorn didn't speak. He bent down, his knees cracking in protest, and picked something up from the floor near her boots. It was a single, small, brass shell casing from her suppressed pistol, one of the two she had fired to end the exercise. He held it in his palm, the metal warm against his calloused skin. It was dented on one side from where it had hit the wall after being ejected. He looked at the casing, then back at her. He held it out to her. It was not an order. It was an offering. Sorensen looked at the casing in his hand, then back up at his face. For the first time, she saw the hard mask of the Master Chief crack. In his eyes, she saw a profound, unspoken acknowledgement. It was a concession, an apology, a welcome. It was respect, offered in the silent language of warriors, a language she understood better than any other. She reached out and took the casing from his palm, her fingers closing around it. She gave him a short, sharp nod. The nod was her acceptance. Thorn straightened up, his back ramrod straight. He looked out at the rest of his platoon, his expression now one of cold fury. "The rest of you," he growled, his voice low and menacing, "you have a lot of work to do. Hit the classroom. We're going over basic CQC until your eyes bleed. You embarrassed yourselves. You embarrassed this team. You embarrassed the uniform." He turned and strode out of the room without another word. The message was clear. The debrief was over. The verdict had been delivered. The men stood in stunned silence. The full weight of what had happened, of who Sorensen was, began to sink in. They weren't just on a team with a female officer. They were on a team with a legend, a living ghost story. And they had treated her like a liability. Rivas finally moved. He walked over to the gear rack, his movements stiff and mechanical. He picked up his own rifle, but he didn't start cleaning it. He just stood there, holding the weapon, staring at the far wall. The man known as Bull had been broken. The foundation of his identity, built on physical strength and aggressive dominance, had been shattered by quiet, invisible competence. He had tried to end her career before it began, to bully her out of the platoon. Instead, in the space of a few seconds in a dark room, she had ended his. Not his naval career, but the persona he had built around it. He would never be Bull in the same way again. The name felt like a joke. Sorensen, holding the warm shell casing in her fist, went back to her work. She began meticulously cleaning the bolt carrier group of her rifle, her focus absolute. The quiet scrape of her cleaning rod against the inside of the barrel was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of order being restored, the sound of a professional at peace. Later that night, the armory was a sanctuary of controlled quiet. The scent of solvent and steel hung heavy in the air, a familiar incense. Echo Platoon was engaged in the ritualistic cleaning of their weapons, a task that was both a duty and a form of meditation. The boisterous, backslapping atmosphere that usually filled the space after a day of training was gone, replaced by a somber, focused energy. The clicks of bolts sliding into place, the soft whisk of brushes and barrels, and the snap of magazines being seated were the only sounds. It was a language of penance. Maya Sorensen worked at a bench in the corner, a pool of clean, white light from an overhead lamp isolating her from the rest of the room. Her M4 carbine and her Sig Sauer pistol lay completely disassembled on her cleaning mat. Each spring, pin, and lever was arranged in a perfect, orderly line. She cleaned each component not as a chore, but with the focused reverence of a surgeon preparing their instruments. Her movements were unhurried, graceful, and utterly efficient. She was a universe of calm in a room thick with unspoken tension. The other members of the team kept their distance, stealing furtive glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. They saw her differently now. They were no longer looking at a female lieutenant, a political appointment, or a weak link. They were looking at Nix. The name had spread through the platoon like wildfire, whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. They were seeing the Spectre, the operator who had moved through their chaos like it was her natural habitat. Bull Rivas had been working on his shotgun at the far end of the armory, scrubbing at the barrel with a ferocity that was more about punishing himself than cleaning the weapon. He had been silent for hours, locked in his own private hell of humiliation. His world had been turned upside down. For years, he had believed that combat effectiveness was a direct product of aggression, strength, and overwhelming force. Sorensen was none of those things. She was quiet, she was precise, and she was more dangerous than anyone he had ever met. His entire philosophy of warfare had been proven not just wrong but naive. Finally, he put down his cleaning rod. He screwed a cap back on a bottle of solvent, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood up, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Jensen stopped mid-scrub, his eyes wide. Miller froze with a patch halfway down his rifle barrel. They thought Rivas was going to confront her, to start another round of conflict, this time born of pure desperation. Rivas didn't walk toward Sorensen. He walked to the main supply locker and took out a fresh cleaning mat and a full, unopened master cleaning kit. He then walked back, his boots heavy on the concrete floor, and stopped not at his own bench, but at the empty one directly beside Sorensen's. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. He unrolled the new mat, its clean, black surface a stark contrast to her well-worn one. He opened the new kit and began methodically laying out the brushes, jags, and solvents, arranging them with a precision that was a clumsy imitation of her own. He then retrieved his rifle and began to disassemble it again, from scratch. It was a silent, profound gesture. It was not an apology. The kind of men in that room didn't traffic in apologies. It was an act of submission, an acknowledgement. By choosing to work next to her, to mirror her process, he was wordlessly admitting her superiority. He was placing himself in the position of a student, hoping to learn by proximity. He was abdicating his self-appointed role as the platoon's alpha and tacitly recognizing a new center of gravity. Sorensen gave no outward sign that she had noticed. She continued her work, her focus unbroken. She picked up the bolt of her rifle, wiped it down with a soft cloth until it gleamed under the light, and inspected it for any microscopic fractures or signs of wear. But a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The tension in the room did not vanish, but it transformed. The hostile, resentful energy dissipated, replaced by a heavy, watchful respect. The other men, seeing Rivas's silent concession, slowly relaxed. They returned to their own work, but their movements were less agitated, more focused. A new, unspoken order had been established. An hour passed in this shared, monastic silence. Sorensen was the first to finish. She reassembled her rifle with the fluid, practiced motions of someone who could do it blindfolded. The final click of the forward assist seating the bolt was sharp and final in the quiet room. She did the same with her pistol. Both weapons were now immaculate, perfect tools ready for their purpose. She stood and slung her rifle over her shoulder. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Rivas's for a brief moment. He had stopped working and was watching her, his expression raw and unguarded. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a deep, weary understanding. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Sorensen held his gaze for a second longer. She returned the nod, just as slight, just as final. Then she turned and walked out of the armory, her footsteps echoing softly before disappearing into the night. She left behind a room of changed men and the small, brass shell casing sitting on the corner of her bench, a gleaming testament to the day the night had come to kill House Omega. It was a silent trophy, a symbol of a battle won not with volume, but with silence. not with force but with precision. A quiet reminder that the most dangerous threats are the ones you never see coming.